Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm Ken Levine, the president and creative director of 2K Boston. I got a couple things to read here. Housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded. We want to encourage you to use the aisle mic for any questions. Don't forget to fill out the report sheets. There will be a test. Due to the weather, the line for today's 10:30 a.m. keynote will begin in the lower lobby in the North Hall. Please do not line up outside of the Esplanade or South Hall. You'll be directed to the end of the line in the lower lobby. Okay? Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm going to remove the World of Warcraft icon here now and get my PowerPoint presentation running. Everybody knows what a wow whore I am. So today I'm going to be here to talk about storytelling, narrative, and the differences between the two. I think that as a guy who sort of has become known for story, I have an interesting approach to it just from who I am, that I really am not a fan of game story. And what I'm going to talk about today in general is how we, in BioShock, used different approaches to engage the gamer and make them care about our stupid story. Well, I think the first big secret is, and maybe, this comes from me mostly in my experiences, is that the bad news is for storytellers is that nobody cares about your stupid story. Nobody cares about the thing you've been writing about in your math notebook since you were in 11th grade, about, the Dark Lord, Lord Blagon, and, the fifth period of the Elven Uprising, and all that crap that you've been working on forever. I know that's hard to hear because you care about it a lot, but the audience has no reason, they're not your mom. They have no reason to be predisposed positively to the things you've been thinking about. And this is what's going to hurt no matter how detailed or lovingly you crafted it. So the challenge is we all want the same thing, right? We want people to engage in our story. We want people to engage in our narrative. So how do we get people to do that if they're sort of predisposed, like any piece of fiction, originally predisposed not to care about it? How do we seduce them to caring about it? Well, I think one of the first things I want to tell everybody is that details, though they seem like the hard work, they seem like the important part, they're not your friend. Details can really drag you down. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is, how to choose what details are important and what isn't, and what you should exclude. Hold on. So, what we realized at some point during the making of BioShock is the best narrator, the best storyteller that we had is not a cutscene. It's not live digital characters. It's not lip syncing. It's the world, right? What is the thing we render best in video games? We're starting to get there with facial animation. We're starting to get there with character animation. But the world, all the benefits of graphics have really come about that we can use static meshes to make this incredibly detailed world. And what is the player looking at most of the time? And not looking at when you force him to look at a cutscene. But what is he engaged in most of the time? And he honestly engaged at his own pace, which is, that's what's great about video games, right? Not that we're forcing people to do things, but that they have interactivity. He's engaged in the world. And so much of our, and at this point, it's nearly 100% authentic, graphically. If you look, look around here, I was in my hotel room last night, I was looking around, and I said, we can basically render this at this point. We can pretty much render this almost 100% accurately. If you get up, maybe the textures blur a little bit, but, pretty much. And then you think about most games, and you think about the warehouses and the sewers and the office buildings, and it just occurs to you, and as you'll see today, we are not, at Irrational, we were not immune to this thinking. There's so many missed opportunities in the primary experience to give player narrative. Okay, so this concept of telling the story in the world, this didn't happen for us overnight. And today I'm going to show something that I'd like to thank Chris Klein, our lead programmer, who put together a while ago, of a prototype we did a couple of years ago, when we were first working on BioShock. And I think it's going to show our first approach to it, and what's striking, well, I'm not going to say what's striking. Why don't you take a look at it, at what's striking. and how different it is from the final game. Now you can see this is, you can see the pistol that ended up somewhat similar to the pistol of the original game. You can see the corridors. You can see some water coming in. It's an underwater city. But what's missing? You see corridors. You see some destruction, like some crates. Hey, time to crate here is around 15 seconds. I'm going to talk about what that is in a little bit. But the world, it's not saying very much to us here. It's a world I think it's reasonably well detailed in terms of texture maps and everything. Here's some early monsters. You can see a Big Daddy who appeared fairly early and near to his final form. But what is the world saying to us here? What is it telling us about the world of Rapture? Not very much. Now, for those of you who may have forgot, I'm going to show this in a minute. So we did this prototype. And I learned something after a prototype. When I looked at it, I figured out the best way to make a team hate you, which is look at the prototype that they worked hard and earnestly on for a very, very long time and really did their best on, and having to make a judgment in collaboration with the team, is this the thing we want to go out with? Is this the thing that's going to make people say, oh my God, that's amazing? This is, prior to E3. And we basically decided to scrap the whole thing and start again. And we have the opportunity and the luxury to do that. But there's a huge emotional cost. So if you make a call like that, it's not always very easy. And then, we worked and we worked and we worked. And, eventually we started to realize the techniques that I'm going to talk about today, which brought the world you saw before to become the world you're seeing, that you're familiar with and you see in BioShock now. And the incredible amount of detail that came across in the narrative and the storytelling of the world. Okay, hold on. Hold on. Okay, so something that may surprise people, and this is counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of storytellers. I think people think about storytelling as something you build up over time. I was on a panel a couple weeks ago with Greg from Harmonix and Ray from BioWare, and we were talking about how our job compares to like that of a sculptor. A sculptor takes a giant slab of stone, right? And he chips away at it until he gets a statue. The problem with our job is first we have to make the giant pile of stone, and then we have to chip away at it. And the problem is that we sit there doing all that work to make that pile of stone. It's really painful to chip away because that making it was so difficult to do. But something we learned in BioShock is as time went on, we just made our story simpler and simpler and simpler. What we started out with dozens of characters. We started out with the game taking place over around 50 or 60 years, 70 years, with like 3 different civil wars that happened and like 15 different scientists and all these love triangles and all these different characters. And we had this concept of something called the Group, which is a bunch of savants and tanks who ruled the city and all the interactions you have with them. And frankly, when I think back on it, I reread the document recently, I couldn't even understand it. And if it was a novel, maybe it would have become a pretty bad novel. But the interface you have with the game audience when it comes to telling a story is actually very, very limited in terms of actually getting them to think about characters and settings and background. So one of the first things I focused on, and I think it's a good thing for any guy thinking about macro narrative focus on, is who are your main characters and what do they want? That's storytelling 101, but sometimes it gets distracted. In 2006, we basically took a knife, had a knife of the long knives, and we massacred almost all of our characters. We killed, maybe a dozen scientists died, and a bunch of politicians, and these guys in the tanks all dead. And we sort of started focusing on each character gets to represent a single idea, a single concept in the game. And I'm going to illustrate that right now. 1 second. I'm going to go back and forth to the sound here today. So, when we wanted to talk about the Civil War and Rapture and what happened, I came up with this character of Diane McClintock. And you sort of follow her through the whole narrative of BioShock from the very beginning where she's at a New Year's Eve party and she gets her face disfigured in a bomb blast she's Andrew Ryan's mistress. You go through her relationship with him and her breakup with Ryan, and then she gets involved with the rebel leader Atlas. And what her purpose was her purpose was not to tell the story of Diane McClintock, it was to tell the gamer what happened in this war, if they want to follow it.
Another New Year's, another night alone. I'm out and you're stuck in Festus, working. Imagine my surprise. I guess I'll have another drink. Here's a toast to Diane McClintock, silliest girl in Rapture. Silly enough to fall in love with Andrew Ryan. Silly. What happened? I'm bleeding. Oh God. What's happening?
And we follow her through from that traumatic event. And when players hear her voice then, they say, okay, they start getting attuned, this is the kind of information I'm going to get from her. And she's the only one, really, who tells that story. And that's really important, that she's focused and separated. Ryan's content...
Mr. Ryan, I believe in Rapture. But that doesn't mean we always win. Fontaine Futuristics is the biggest thing going in Rapture. So let me be plain. When we arrest that Torag Fontaine for his thieving and smuggling, we must make it clear that we won't touch his business interests. We sit on the council because these poor sods trust us, not because God gave us a chair.
So we wanted to have that narrative of how Rapture could have gone right for the people who cared about that, and that character's there to represent that. And then, what is the impact of the war? What is the impact of the big daddies and little sisters on the little people of Rapture?
We saw our Masha today. We barely recognize her. That's her, Sam said. You're crazy, I told him. That thing? That is our Masha? But he was right. She was drawing blood out of a corpse by Fontaine Fisheries. And then when she was done, she walked off hand in hand with one of those awful golems. Masha!
And it was challenging. You have these characters that you build up and you start to love, to focus them and really not allow them to go outside of that space. But it's very important for the audience to understand who they are and what you're getting across, that you limit that focus with them in a video game. Okay, push versus pull. What am I talking about here? What's a cutscene? What is the purpose of a cutscene? The purpose of a cutscene is to push information at the player that you want them to see all of it. Same as movies, right? When you go to a movie, you have the same experience as the next guy, has the same experience as the next guy, any kind of linear media. That's not what video games, that's not our advantage. That's not our strength. We have the ability not to push information at people, but to let them pull it to them. And let me talk about that for a second. Why is that better? Because, the biggest problem is, and this is something we came across on BioShock all the time, is people going, well, aren't they going to miss that? There's a million cutscenes, and the first thing I have to say is hat tip to Valve on all this concept, because I think Half-Life was the real pioneer here. We just tried to sort of extend in that space. But the answer is, yeah, they may miss it. They may miss a lot of it. In BioShock, I'm going to talk about the different kinds of people who play and their different interests in the story. You have to accept they're going to miss maybe most of it. But you know what? That's okay, because the people who engage, the people who care, the people who pull it towards them are going to be so passionate about that stuff because they were engaged in the decision to pull it towards them, and it wasn't forced of them. We decided to give the player the option to opt out of a lot of our narrative, that if they weren't interested in, we weren't going to force it on them, with the hope that for the people who opted in, that it'll be all that much more powerful because they were engaged in the process. So we talk about the 3 levels of story in BioShock. There's the game for, the guys who go into, we did some focus testing on BioShock. And I remember one of the key questions we asked is, which of these new franchises are you interested in? Assassin's Creed, BioShock, all these huge franchises coming out that, all of us nerds were salivating over. And their answer was, and it's a focus group and we did like 40 people, Madden? Halo 3, the truth is that people have no idea about new franchise, that we're so into this, all of us here are so into this, that it's so hard to understand what the actual guy in their experience of what games are compared to our experience, because it's our passion. When when you go into a supermarket, and I see a new kind of Oreo, like spring Oreos. I haven't been reading on the Oreo website, 6 months in advance about spring Oreos coming out. I'm all excited. I'm posting on the message boards and getting the internet flame wars about it. Halloween Oreos are better. Fuck you. So if you're going to have a deep narrative, you have to understand that a lot of people are just not going to care. And you have to make the game playable for those people who don't care. So we decided to go sort of for 3 levels of story. The first level is, what do I basically need to do? Who do I got to kill? Where do I got to go? Andrew, Ryan, well, I don't know. Who's that? I don't care. I need to kill that guy. That's the most basic level. And we had to make sure that people understood that, and we supported that, and people who just want to come into BioShock and blow crap up would be able to do that. And I think we hit those people. I think, the sales numbers reflect that we were able to hit those people. Because if you don't hit those people, you're going to be making those games, those beloved games that Irrational had made many of, that sold 150,000 units. And, have a great place in my heart. But in the economics today, you want to be able to have your cake and eat it too. Then there's the second level of story, which is, oh yeah, I got to kill this guy, Andrew Ryan. He runs this place, and that Fontaine guy, he's trouble. And Tenenbaum, she's with those little girls, right? There's that level of story that people who have some interest can vaguely follow along. And I usually fall in this group when I'm playing games of having some interest in the story of what's going on. And we have to support that. And then there's that final level of, I compare it to, there are kids who will listen to music and they'll like it and they'll dance to it or they'll get into it. And then there's the weird kid in the back of their classroom who's writing all the Nirvana lyrics on his notebook. That's the level of the people who get into a game that you have to support. The hardcore fan that, we really try to support in BioShock with, I don't talk about all the storytelling methodologies today, to give them that love that they want to get as much detail out of this world. They want a novelistic level of detail. If they want to be able to look at every poster and find every little nook and cranny, they want to go write an essay about it for their college class, that we want to support that. And that's there, but that can't get in the way of the experience of the guy who just plays Madden and Halo. One thing that I think that's really important we need to embrace is we have several narrative vehicles that only games have. And for many years, we sort of try to copy from other industries. And, somebody asked me a question at another speaking event I was at, and they said, you say you don't like cutscenes, but, aren't there great cutscenes in games? Final Fantasy. And look, and who can argue with that success? It's clearly, they're the best at what they do. But I think if you step back and you ask yourself, where are games going? Are we going towards more cutscenes? Are we going to more sort of interactive narrative? I think that's pretty clear where we need to go. And I think his question is, how do we get there? And we definitely, to watch those masters at Square do that stuff, it's amazing. But I think as time goes on, maybe they'll be able to bring those skills more and more into the non-traditional narrative space, into this interactive space. So in BioShock, we try to explore as much of the things that's exclusive to games in terms of telling story. One thing was the audio logs, which are definitely an opt-in, opt-out thing for players. We try to fill the audio space as much as possible with so much data that a lot of people would miss most of it. I have some of the PSAs here for people to remind people.
Hey, Mary, what's with the sourpuss?
Have you heard what's going on down in Apollo Square? I hear they're putting people in cages.
There you go again, Mary. Listening to the rumor bug. Rapture Security is just rounding up the worst of the worst until the council can try them in a proper forum.
People say there have been executions.
People say lots of irresponsible things. That doesn't mean you have to embolden Atlas and his bandits by repeating them. Remember, Mary, Rapture Security is our security.
Oh, that's Nate Wells, who's been in pretty much every one of our games. He was in Thief. He was in all the Thief games. He's our art director, and he's one of the best voice actors, I think, working in the industry. And he's amazing. nuclear winter and freedom force for the old school fans.
Andrew Ryan reminds us we all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.
Little things a lot of people miss in the background. Sounds from a gatherer's garden machine.
My daddy's smarter than Einstein, stronger than Hercules, and lights a fire with a snap of his finger. Are you as good as my daddy, mister? Not if you don't visit the gatherer's garden, you aren't. Smart daddies get sliced at the garden. My daddy's smarter than Einstein.
If I forget I want to talk about that last one when I talk about the writer's role the writer and designer's role in being on the product until very late. I want to remember to come back to that. Okay, another important lesson that we learned, and this is something I think we learned very early on when we were making System Shock 2, is don't do what you can't do. And look, games have limitations, right? Games are not the real world. And a lot of the problems that people encounter in terms of suspending their disbelief is they run up to something that just that breaks, that doesn't work. The typical example is, the open city game where you walk up to somebody and they don't interact with you, or you try to go into a building and you can't. And the worst examples are where you have linear corridor shooters where there are all those doors that are mysteriously locked and others that are, or just a texture as compared to an object and you can't go through them. And all those things take the player out of the game. And the reason we do them is because we have limitations and we want to do as much cool stuff as possible. With BioShock and System Shock 2, we started by saying, what are our limitations and how can we embrace those? One thing we want to do is we want to put the player in a constrained environment, a constrained, believable environment. In System Shock 2, it was a spaceship. Hey, it's understandable why you can't walk off a spaceship. It's understandable why that's a limited space. In BioShock, it was an underwater city. The other thing we did is, as you probably noticed, a lot of people are dead. A lot of people you can't interact with. I'm of this school that believes that if you can't do something well, don't do it. And real people have a real problem. There's always breaking cases, and if you use them, you have to be very careful. And I think we catch some heat for this, and I think it's understandable that people want more character interaction. But anything that breaks, that lifts that veil that opens the curtain and there's the wizard, the little tiny wizard standing behind there, that's going to cause you problems. So you have to decide very carefully if you're going to take on something that maybe is outside of your grasp. So the underwater city, as strange as it sounds, the Randy and Utopia at the bottom of the sea was more believable than a lot of game spaces. And that's because we set up a very particular constraint set. These are the rules of the city. That, it's underwater. You won't be able to have access to the surface. Hey, it's an underwater city. Anything we didn't want to have from the real world that we didn't want to have, we just didn't have to have. The period was useful because, look, one thing you can do that can really be alienating to a player is show them something that's new and entirely unfamiliar and has no frame of reference for them. Essentially, BioShock was a period piece. It was a very strange period piece, but everybody was familiar with that period of time, the music, all that stuff. It gave a sense of familiarity. There's a thing about movies. You can say that your movie can be about an alien coming to Earth or an Earthling going to an alien world. It can't be about an alien going to an alien world because the audience has no frame of reference for that, at least in a piece of popular fiction. BioShock's plot, I talk about the characters getting simple. Very important. If you want people to follow along with your plot, it has to be really fucking stupid. Like really simple. What your goal in Act 1 of BioShock is get to the sub and escape Rapture. Everybody can follow that. What's your goal in Act 2? Oh, well, the sub blew up. I guess we gotta kill Ryan to get out. Kill Ryan. Well, then you get screwed over by Fontaine. What's your goal in Act 3? Go kill Fontaine. Giving those player that very clear arc allows him to then focus on some details. Because if he's got his big picture taken care of, he knows where his bread and butter is coming from, what he's basically doing, he'll go with you to a lot of weird and strange places. A great example of a film is Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you stopped Indiana Jones at any scene in that movie and you said, Indy, what are you doing now? What would he say? Looking for the Ark. Every scene, looking for the Ark. He comes to Marion in the tent. She's trapped, kidnapped. Is he going to save her? No, he's looking for the Ark. He's busy. And it's a brilliant scene because it goes against the audience expectation of the hero. but it also focuses that character. So it allows you, once you have that solidity, you can get really weird around it. And with BioShock, obviously there's a huge amount of weirdness around it, but we use that solidity to ground us. My friend Joe here is from England, and he gets upset sometimes on my accents. I put him in the games because sometimes they're not always entirely accurate. Why so many accents in BioShock? When people heard voices, I wanted them to know who it was. Very simple. And you hear Atlas talk, you hear Ryan talk, you hear Tenenbaum talk. You have a reasonably Irish guy, a sort of Russian immigrant, and a strangely Eastern European woman. You have no doubt who it is each time you hear that person. It's a very simple technique and effective. BioShock's a detective story. What's an interesting thing about detective stories as a form of traditional media is they're interactive. They ask the audience to participate in a process of whodunit, right? That everybody watching an Agatha Christie movie or reading an Agatha Christie book is gaming it in some way, trying to figure out. There's a meta concept of not just reading a book and finding out what's going to happen in the nanny diaries. It's about who did it and how and where you are and how smart you are in the process. And a detective story is a very natural thing for a game because games are interactive. One of the things the reason it took us this long to get to be able to tell really good detective stories. And look, BioShock's a detective story. You come down to this mysterious place. Everybody's dead. What happened? And that's what you spend most of your time doing, figuring out what happened. What do our graphical capabilities give us? They give us the ability to make wheat and chaff. Now, back in the Doom days, right? Back in the Quake days, we only could render the wheat, the important stuff. What else could you render? The monsters, the weapons floating out in the middle of space. It's not, nobody's fault. It's all we could do. What does all this processing power give us? Better filters, better frame buffer effects. It gives us the ability to render a huge amount of density. And in that density, you can put all of that detail wherein the player can try to find what's important. And the important stuff and the less important stuff mixed together. And a detective story, if you're playing Clue and all you have is Professor Plum, and all you got is the wrench, and all you got is the dining room, it's not a game of Clue. You need all that chaff around you to make a good mystery story. You're also the amount of detail in the world. If the player is watching, you want to, like any good mystery, you want to reward the really, really observant player for picking things up. You'll find tons of little details in BioShock that reward the player who goes to that third level of investment. You'll hear Atlas talk about his poor wife and child, Moira and Patrick, which of course are a fabrication, as you find out later. If you look carefully around the world, you'll see posters for a popular theatrical production called Moira and Patrick. And the observant player will spot this and maybe start to get something in his head that this guy isn't entirely on the level. There's a lot of little details in that you can do because now we can render the chaff. Narrative versus story. Okay, what's the difference? Well, story, I think, is what you tell people, and narrative is what they choose to have told to them. The push versus pull model we talked about before. And it's very important that you integrate all your storytelling stuff as much as you can tightly with what the player is doing gameplay-wise. What are some of the two most important story elements in BioShock? Little sisters and big daddies and plasmids, because that's the whole sort of moral arc of the game, what people did to their bodies and what they're doing to these children. They're also two of the most important gameplay elements in the game. And we spend a ton of time with them on talking about them in a narrative sense, where the player can participate in them. And if the player is not just an outside observer of this storytelling element, but is actually involved in it, he'll get much more engaged. For instance, the Little Sister Big Daddy is probably the biggest sort of technical gameplay innovation in the game. And one of the reasons, and I'm going to talk about the evolution of Little Sister, one of the reasons they worked and people understood them, and we were surprised in focus testing how quickly people got their relationship, is because they were based on a very understandable narrative. Little girl, father. Everybody saw that connection right away. And at one point, we didn't have that connection. The little sister wasn't a little sister, and I'll show you the evolution. And making people understand that relationship was very difficult. You had this sort of core narrative element of little girl, child, parent. Everybody understood that relationship immediately, and therefore explaining the game concept to them became much clearer, let alone the empathy people started feeling for the characters. Surprised us is the empathy people felt for the Big Daddy. We expected people to be worried about hurting the little sister. We got a lot of feedback saying people were worried about the Big Daddy. In fact, they didn't like hurting the Big Daddies because he appeared in many ways like a father figure. Depends how you feel about your father. All right, we get a little pretentious here. Mise en scène, and Greg Goby, our French friend at 2K, will probably criticize my lack of accent grave or aigu there, I think. What is mise en scène? It means literally to present, make a scene. And a lot of film has done this, and what BioShock tried to do is, we talked about using the gameplay space to tell story, a fairly detailed story about a character or a setting. And I'm going to show you a bunch of it here, without words. You can see a little bit of Cohen, a little bit of introduction to Dr. Steinman, you see. Before you meet these guys, I was in a play in high school called The Odd Couple. Everybody know The Odd Couple? Felix and Oscar. And I played Oscar. That was awesome. And the first 20 minutes of it, Felix doesn't show up. But they're talking about Felix. And they're just talking about, what a neat freak is, and how annoying he is, and how weird he is. And by the time he shows up, you're fully ready for this guy, and the audience is just dying to meet this guy. Now think about Dr. Steinman. You saw some of it here, or Andrew Ryan, or Sandra Cohen. You don't actually meet them after you've been hearing about them for a very long period of time. You're not hearing about them like looking at think of Steinman's level, the whole medical level. And actually the level I showed you earlier from the prototype, that was the old medical level. That was the original medical level. Didn't tell you anything about Steinman. When you finally meet Steinman, what is he? He's a guy with a machine gun, and a medical mask. He's not very much, but you've been set up for him through the world, through his scrawlings and his rantings and the pictures of the women and hearing about this, what he did to people, to invest emotionally in this guy. So by the time you meet him and he's just some, AI running around with a machine gun, John, a very well done AI, by the way, because that's what they are at the end of the day. I mean, our digital actors are not exactly, they're not Brando. But we've set him up so the players invested emotionally and they have an engagement, they have a feeling about this guy. And that's really important to do. And mise en scène, Sandra Cohen, the whole world of Sandra Cohen, Jordan Thomas and Stephen Alexander came up with this idea for those plaster figures. What exactly they are? We'll talk about them in a minute. Who knows? I don't even know exactly what the purpose of those things are. But they set up the world of Sandra Cohen, this whole art gone mad world. And by the time you meet him, even though he has this big introduction, he's, you have a relationship with him. And so the AI has to carry a lot less weight. 1 second. Mystery. Our goal, generally your feeling as a storyteller is you want to answer questions for people, right? You want to tell people, what's going on in your world. Well, I guess what I'm here to say today is that's generally not always a great idea. That telling the player what's going on, asking questions, sometimes is not really, answering questions is not as interesting as asking them. We use mystery and ambiguity. Let me lower this a little bit. A ton in BioShock. That we want the players to see things right from the very beginning, where, with the lighthouse sequence, where they're sort of like, where am I? What is this? What's going on? Who is this guy? Who's Sandra Cohen? Who's Dr. Simon? Who's Andrew Ryan? Who's Alice? Who are all these people? These mysteries are really important, and that we may, who are the little sisters? And we didn't answer those questions right away. We sort of kept them going. I think I've learned a lot from, from movies here. Answering questions is asking questions more interesting than answer them. I mean, think of Lost. What is their entire stock and trade? It's basically asking a bunch of questions which they don't answer for a very long time. Think of Cloverfield. What is that? It's Godzilla with less information, right? That's all it is. And it's so effective because it's such a tired notion. Giant monster comes to a city, and all they did is they limited the information field, and they reinvented the whole genre by doing that. Japanese horror films, The Ring, is it really that interesting what you find out about that movie at the end? It's kind of, it's kind of banal in a little ways. But the mystery set up at the beginning of watching that movie and wondering what's it about is so powerful. We call it the mystery balloon because we're pretentious. So think of a sort of a helium balloon, a half-filled helium balloon, that is sort of naturally sort of going down. And that's mystery in your game or your story. And your job is to tap it back up again before it gets too low. But the problem is, if you keep tapping it up too high, see season 3 of Lost, you start losing your audience because they want some questions answered, but they don't want all the questions answered. So you got to think of it as this balloon that's sort of constantly coming down. You have to keep tapping up and keep tapping up. And if you do it too high, you'll lose people, and if it gets too low, you'll lose people. One thing that occurred to us very late in the game is, because I had played the last levels of the game because I knew all the mysteries going on, obviously. There was no mysteries for me, so I didn't have that angle on the game working on it, and as game makers, we don't often have that angle. The last levels as gameplay, I think, were some of the strongest levels in the game. But when we answered the whole question about Ryan, and that big question was gone and who you were, the balloon hit bottom. The mystery balloon hit bottom. And people were left hanging. And I underestimated the impact that would have on the game and people's perception of the game and how important that mystery was to keep them going. I mean, think of Twin Peaks. When you found out who killed Laura Palmer, what was left? So you have to be very careful with this because the hand that gives can also taketh away. And that's what happened in the third act of BioShock, and I think we learned a big lesson there. The opening of BioShock is a classic example. I think there's a lot of different ways you could have done this opening. A lot of traditional video games do the Centaurian voice of the narrator coming on and saying, in the third era, blah, 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 and they tell you this long stream of information, usually riddled with like 150 proper nouns that you'll never remember, lots of, letters with apostrophes in them, words with apostrophes. We asked, we didn't answer, we gave a lot of mystery, and, but however, a little video from here, it was based on a very familiar notion, Robinson Crusoe, the castaway. You're in a plane crash, you're cast away, you're in a strange place, what do you do? So again, even though with all the mystery, you had this sort of basic understanding of what your experience was that people could follow through. Second. We thought a lot of different ways to do the opening of BioShock. Went through a lot of different, there's a lot of story to tell about the city and everything. And we had a version, which we did early, that I'm going to show you today, that we cut. I want to know what you guys, think of it.
In 1946, a wealthy industrialist named Andrew Ryan decided he had had enough of government and religion, so he decided to do something about it. Building a small army of contractors, he constructed a city at the bottom of the ocean, a city called Rapture. The goal of this city was to allow pseudo-objectivists to live a life free of interference from the government and the church. He filled the city with the best and the brightest, but something went horribly wrong. Led by Dr. Tenenbaum and Dr. Souchong, there were incredible genetic discoveries made in this city. These discoveries were called plasmids and gene tonics. They gave people incredible powers, such as the ability to cast fireballs and move things with their minds. But a man named Frank Fontaine ruined everything. Now you're on a transcontinental flight right over the sunken city itself.
Yeah, we fired that guy. I don't know what happened to him after that. I guess the point is that it's not there's a huge amount of information we could have given at the beginning. And there's 1,000 different ways to tell a story. And the same information, different ways, and you may have a great story there. And it's a question of, you have this giant pile of stone is what you chisel away and when you present stuff to people. Let's talk about a particular example of how a gameplay and narrative element evolved. I want you to meet the little sister. This is the first version of what we had for the gatherer concept, the gameplay concept of the character. We had that big daddy, you saw that thing in the prototype. This would walk around with the big daddy, and the big daddy would protect it. Why? It's that's one of the biggest problems. Why the fuck would the big daddy protect this thing? And that was a real problem because this thing it had no ability to emote, it had no ability to relate to the big daddy. Originally the game was much more systemic. Like there was this whole AI, there was a whole ecology with it was all, we had thinking about building prototypes with overhead views where we could see how they gathered and how much resources they had. And then it's like we realized, who cares? It's not about that. It's not about this giant simulation. It's all about what the player's perception of this is. So it started to evolve. Version 2. A little better, not a lot better. Empathy, I don't know. But his role started evolving. He became not something that sucked up, the genetic material. It had this little gas station attendant thing, I guess. More evolution. It is what it is. And then one day, Rob Waters and we were talking about how we build more empathy for this character. We got this. Okay. Is this something that maybe players can relate to? Is this something that can have a relationship with the big daddy that we can make clear? Started to evolve more. And then with the little sister we have there. And as that narrative notion evolved, because her gameplay function didn't change, right? As a narrative notion evolved, the audience's ability to understand and relate to it evolved, and the storytelling ideas that came out of it. I mean, imagine, Tenenbaum, if she was crying about those little bugs, it just, like, lady, you've got to take a vacation or something. It opened up all these opportunities strictly by changing the narrative approach to this concept. A confession to make. I pissed off some people on the project because my story stuff tends to be very, very, very late. And there's some real valid, I think there's a real valid point there that games are very complicated to build, right? There's a lot of assets to build. There's a lot of questions to be answered. However, I'm here to speak a little bit in defense of why storytelling should come late. The story didn't really gel until, as I said, it evolved. We were working on it, and it evolved over years. We were working on this thing. I think for a writer working on a game, it's really important that he be open to the game and have the game tell him what its story is as much as he's telling the game what its story is. And as a designer on the game and as the writer on the game, being involved in the process of doing level reviews, of working with the art director and going through all this stuff on a day-to-day basis, I would get so many ideas out of what I would see and the levels and the art that was coming out that I'd just be filled with excitement and going off and writing stuff based on what I saw. Like when Mauricio and Mike designed the Gatherer's Garden machine. I gave them this idea, I want something from Disney World in the 50s, like with an Alice in Wonderland feel. They go off and do this beautiful machine. I'm recording with the actress the next day, and we do that Gatherer's Garden. We do this Gatherer's Garden song that I wrote on the spot for her, and she sang it. Her voice wasn't great. We had to change the pitch a little bit. But all these opportunities that come up when you're working on things. If you're just like a writer throwing things over the fence, if you just expect to deliver a script a year ahead of time, if you're not open to engaging with the game as it's evolving, you're not going to be able to integrate the story and the gameplay enough. And I think if there's one reason BioShock's story is what it is, because I had the luxury, thanks to the hard work of my team, to make those changes so late on. Look, everybody knows we make balance changes late in the game. Everybody knows you move spawn points late in the game. The story is no different. And it's tough. There's a lot of downstream effects of that. But I think if you want a narrative, if you're looking at BioShock as an example of narrative, one of the reasons, if you feel it's successful, is because of the luxury of time and how late we're able to make changes in the story. As I talked about, though, there's real cost to this model. It's a much bigger strain on production, but I think if you don't, it's very, very tough to do it if you don't have that approach. The last thing I want to say is, this is a new medium, not storytelling. It's narrative. It's the ability to put the story in the world, let the player opt in or out. But, that requires a respect for the audience. And that sounds pretentious and stupid, but it's true because we want them to see everything. We want them to experience everything. They may not. You have to trust your audience. You have to trust mystery, that maybe not everything has to be answered. It's certainly not right away. And last, you just got to empower the gamer. Because if you give him that little bit of trust, he'll give it back to you by engaging in your story and engaging in your game world. Thank you very much. Does anybody want to ask any questions? Is there a mic or something? No?
Hello?
Sorry.
I'm right here.
Oh, hey.
Hi. You talked earlier about the difficulty of making empathetic, really intelligent human characters, which is why, every human character you meet dies in about 3 seconds. But what do you think about what Valve is doing in terms of Alex Vance and how she relates to Gordon Freeman, and how might that change the way you look at integrating characters in future games?
I think if you're going to do a character, it's good to be Valve, because nobody does it as well as they do, right? Like, I think that they've advanced that technology really, really far. But the challenge is, and I think, it's something they're very aware of, is that Alex breaks at some point, whether you shoot her or whether you do something that she's not programmed to respond to. And this is not because any lack of intelligence or inspiration on those guys' side. It's just right now it seems like an impossibly hard problem, is how do you make an AI that, the most complex machine in the world, people that respond to things. And our approach generally is, as I said, do things that we do and try to do it to 100%. And if you can't do it to 100%, leave it on the table. Valve's got a different approach, and I don't trust anybody more than them to do that, and to do that as well as anybody possibly can. Thanks.
Hi. How important do you think the whole graphic design and like the identity of the whole world you created was, like the posters you find and stuff like that, the photos you had on the website and so on?
Sorry, what was it?
How important do you think that was for the success of...
How important was the graphic identity of the world to the success of BioShock? I think it was extremely important. Certainly the first thing people reacted to was the game visually, and that it had such a unique look. But, it definitely goes along that same but different thing I was talking about before, that it was something that people could relate to, but it was something very unique, especially to the video game space. I think that we are also tying gameplay and storytelling, that the whole world was about this the whole story was of this idealistic world where the cracks are starting to appear. The fact that we could represent that by making this beautiful idealistic world with the water pouring into it, the cracks appearing, I think we were able to take that storytelling device and turn it into a visual device. I can't imagine BioShock, you saw the prototype, I can't imagine BioShock without its look. Thanks. Yes.
Hi, great talk. I loved it. I didn't want to kill Andrew Ryan.
Yes.
And normally that would violate the rule, don't do what you can't do. But there was a plot device that kind of cleaned it all up. My question would be, in the area of game narratives, in terms of what you can do in a game narrative agency, are we sort of doomed to making games where we have to use plot devices to clean that up?
I never like to predict what people smarter than I are going to come up with. I'm sort of working within the space of what we have now. And look, games are essentially very linear things in the sense that outside of the combat and physics, things are pretty deterministic about what's going to happen. There may be 5 or 6 things that will happen along a plot. And we tend to have one plot at Irrational because I think it's hard enough to come up with one really great plot. And hats off to the BioWare guys for being able to do that, to come up with these multiple branches. But there's still multiple branches, and there is a paradigm shift that may or may not happen at some point, where dynamically generated narrative happens. And because that's what you really want. Because at the end of the day, it's still going to be a bunch of discrete choices unless you can somehow respond as dynamically to a narrative as you can to combat situations. Physics engine for a narrative. But that there are challenges outside of the game space in terms of artificial intelligence and what is the nature of creation and all that crap that is so outside of the realm of where my head's at right now that I can just, hope I fall asleep and wake up 600 years in the future where maybe they figured it out. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi. Before I ask my question, I want to say you built up Dr. Steinman very well to the point where I was actually afraid to find what Dr. Steinman is. And I actually waited about 2 days to get myself psyched up enough to go in. And then I actually see this normal guy cutting and presenting this theater display. And I was going, oh, he's not that bad. But great build-up. You really built up the tension.
Give credit to Nate Wells and the art guys also for really doing a bang-up job in that space.
Yeah. My question is that this time around, for FPS, you did single player, and that fits the platform because of the mystery involved. But in FPS, there's multiplayer, or maybe more important for such a story, in the future, how do you view cooperative play in such a environment? How would you implement it?
How would I implement cooperative play in this environment? Well, with the story, one thing that was interesting in BioShock is that originally I didn't think there was any need to talk about the main character. Like the marketing guys kept saying, who are we going to put on the box? I'm like, put the Big Daddy. And they're like, well, the player's going to think they're the Big Daddy. And we got into all these discussions about it. And they were right in one respect, which is that people want to know who that main character is. In System Shock 2, who was that weird little guy with the glasses? I don't know. I don't care. And nobody seemed to care back then. People want to know now. And once we sort of realized that we had a problem there about who the main character was and what his identity was, that's where some of the plot twists came in about the main character, is solving that problem about, well, this guy's a cipher. What if he really was a cipher? And we actually leveraged that failing, I think, of the game. Now, BioShock story and cooperative are a very strange mix. I don't even know how you would do it without sort of just ruining the mystique of what that was. I think like most things, you need to plan for those stuff. You need to plan for that stuff from the beginning. The Resistance, the new Resistance game. It's very interesting. What they're doing is they're building a cooperative mode that's separate from the single player mode, which is allowing them, hey, and God bless them if they got the money and time to do that.
Yeah.
But they've got so they can focus on a single player experience that's focused for that, a multiplayer experience is focused for that, and a cooperative experience is focused for that. And I think if you're going to do things, I say do them well, and that's why I'm sort of loath to throw in a cooperative mode if it's going to be compromised.
I see.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, so you were talking about how late in the process, in that last 8 months of the story coming together, you were able to play levels, see where they led you, see where that led the narrative. So my question was, before that process was underway, what sort of guidance were you able to give to the mission team? Were they working from just gameplay notions? Were they working from those 3 core act objectives? How did you get them started on the mission process that then led to the iteration?
So the question is, how do we guide the mission team, the guys building the levels, Paul Helquist and his team, during the process before the story was finalized? Yeah. And it's basically you have to come up with a bunch of things to get them going. Like, there was a doctor you were going to kill, that you had to kill, and to get this key to go to the next area. There was the forest that got destroyed. We got all those things. The story things I'm talking about are primarily those details. The mise-en-scène stuff I'm talking about. Right. We had Cohen and what he did. What he did evolved more over gameplay over time. The mission we had before, Atlas was having you kill Cohen's minions to lure Cohen out of hiding, and it just got too weird and abstract, and we just had the idea one day, well, why doesn't Cohen just have you kill his own minions? But that change was mostly predicated on gameplay. The story didn't really change the basic missions, because it's a lot easier to change story than is to mission. So look, you can come up with 1,000 stories to represent a particular mission flow. So we had a mission flow, and I wasn't going to mess with that terribly. We didn't mess with that terribly. Generally, the mission flows got messed with because of gameplay problems, not because of story problems. So it's important to unblock people, but it's also important to realize that the story is going to have as many bugs as any other part of the process. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
one of the things I loved about BioShock was that it posed moral and philosophical questions, and you don't see that a lot in our games. In our games, you often see things that are like, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, and you need to kill the bad guy to finish the game. And so I was really surprised to hear that that story was pushed farther towards the back end of the development. And I was wondering, did you go into it thinking that you were going to pose these moral and philosophical questions, or did that something just come organically?
I don't think we went into it because I think that space has been explored really interestingly by a bunch of people, so that wasn't the bullet point feature for me. Really, when the little sister came along, the opportunity presented itself, and it was sort of an evolution of thinking about Ryan and objectivism, and where capitalism eventually goes if exploitation, if you can go past points of exploitation, and it was a very natural, organic process. But I think it just came out. It came out of what the story was evolving into, not out of a certain goal we set up ahead of time.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Traditionally, video games have been based around difficulty and challenging the player, like reflexes.
Sorry, can you speak up just a little bit?
Sorry, yeah, I've got a quiet voice. Traditionally, video games have been based around difficulty, like challenging the player's reflexes, timing, things like that. And that was largely in the absence of techniques, as you've described today, to communicate a narrative. What role does difficulty play in a game like BioShock, where as a storyteller you're going to want the player to see the end? And I imagine that most games players don't get to the end of, or at least, over the course of games history anyway.
Yeah, the question is, what role does difficulty play when you want people to see your entire story? Difficulty is something we thought very carefully about in BioShock because we wanted to allow the player, we really wanted people to, my feeling is, as a gamer, is I want to finish a game if I can. And I don't want to be frustrated by it. And we have, unlike a book, we have difficulty levels. And that's the value for it. So the instructions I gave to my guys were the easy level of the game. I really want my grandmother to be able to beat the game on the easy level. Because I think there are a lot of people who aren't in it to optimize their plasmids. There are people who want to get into it and play this world. And one thing I've been very gratified by were the number of non-traditional gamers who played BioShock. People who, we wouldn't think of as first-person shooter gamers playing BioShock and getting it and caring about it for exactly the story elements you're talking about. However, we also wanted the hardcore gamer community to play this game and love this game. That's what, all the, the plasmids and the weapons and the world interaction was all about. And the place you do that is in giving the player a lot of choice about that, about how he sets that. And one advantage we have is hardcore gamers are more likely to go into option settings and to make the game harder for themselves. So you want to default to an experience that most people can get through, I think. Thank you.
Just for the record, my grandmother likes bowling on the Wii. I showed her BioShock and she didn't really go for it.
Bring her here.
Yeah. My question is basically around the storytelling mechanic. The comparison with film is almost inescapable, but as you said, it's not an interactive experience. With Half-Life 2, you had a central character that you would never see, never hear, and yet he was who the player was supposed to be. I mean, he's on the front of the box, but that's the only time you really see him.
Yep.
So what influenced your decisions in terms of the player being able to see or hear or just from that aspect?
Well, the question is, what influenced our decision regarding the, how much you could see or hear or know about the main player character?
Yeah.
As I said, we started really not thinking about the main player character. I just thought it didn't matter in a first-person shooter that much. I guess I never really connected with one the way I did in a third-person game. I think in Half-Life, the brilliance of what Gordon Freeman is not Gordon Freeman himself, it's people's reactions to Gordon Freeman. You just see the awe they have for this guy, especially on Half-Life 2. And I think that was a very effective technique. Realizing this a little bit late, as I mentioned before, we tried to turn this into a strength. We realized we had a very facile, paper-thin player character with nothing about him, really. In fact, when we first demoed the game to focus test, we didn't have the sequence on the airplane. That was added where the plane crashes, where you're up there and you look at the picture of your family. There's a huge amount of meta clues in there into the story and what happens later, but none of that stuff existed. That came out of the reaction going like, why are we in the water? Who is this guy? Which is, I think, a very understandable reaction. And it was something we didn't see coming. And once we started filling in a few blanks. And for me, I just want to fill in the bare minimum about who this guy was. For enough to make those people happy. They bought everything else. You know, they bought the world. I got to take just a couple more, 1 or 2 more questions, and I think I got to let people go. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi there. I'm kind of curious. You talked about the 3 levels of storytelling. That first one being really important is just telling the player what to do next, what to do with their avatar. And the big twist, the would you kindly, was a really nice way of tying that into a larger narrative. How far along did that decision kind of take place?
I'm trying to remember the exact time. We knew we wanted very early on, I knew I wanted the notion of the unreliable narrator in the game. So the question was, I have to say it for the audio recording, the question was, when did the sort of twist, the idea for the twist come up in Bioshock, the would you kindly twist? I've always wanted to play with the notion of what I call well, I don't think just me, what is called the unreliable narrator, which is, you know, you see it in movies like Fight Club, you see it in movies like The Usual Suspects, where the audience's perception of events is not necessarily 100% accurate, because what the narrator of the movie, whether it's a literal narrator or the eye of the camera, is telling you, is misleading you in some ways, not lying to you, but sort of playing little tricks with you. And I knew I wanted to do that. I remember I used to go into the design thing and like, damn it, I want an unreliable narrator in this game. They'd be like, yeah, it's great, Ken. You go work on that unreliable narrator. And it took a while to sort of figure out exactly how that was going to work. And as I said, it tied into the sort of the who was this main character, and the fact that he wasn't anybody. And we started thinking, can we turn that into a strength? The fact that he wasn't anybody, that he literally essentially wasn't anybody, that his identity was meaningless, he was a fake. And that sort of started turning into thinking about video game. And people write a lot about this, and one thing we learned bit us in the butt a little bit is playing with that expectation of the player not having control. Because there's sort of a postmodern joke about games, right? That the player doesn't have control, and we throw that in their face. Then people expected us afterwards to give you a level of control which we didn't give you previously in the game. We had no design notion for that in the game. We were basically writing checks with our narrative that our game playing couldn't cash. And that turned into a little bit of a problem, I think, because we set up this expectation. We rub people's face in it, and then we just continue to rub their face in it for the rest of the game. But it evolved over time. It was always something I wanted to do. I can't remember exactly when it came in. Probably, the game shipped in August, probably around the previous August. So. Cool. Thanks. One more question? And then I'll be here for a few minutes if people just want to come up and chat, because I have to let people go. Sorry, go ahead.
So you were talking about the 3 levels of storytelling, and I was wondering if you'd given any thought to or had any ideas about how to solve the problem of someone halfway through the game deciding that they wanted to go to that deeper level, but without replaying the game, catching up on that information they missed. To keep on going on with your Lost analogy, yep. Lost every once in a while does a recap episode or something like that.
That's what the Yahtzee video's for. We'd show them that.
Right.
It's a tough problem. It's almost like a help system, an interactive help system. And, I think supporting that and supporting it at a broad range, of where the people are going to opt in and opt out and when they're going to come in and come out, it's going to be very complex. It's not something we thought about heavily. It didn't seem to bite us in the butt that badly. And I think it would take a lot of work to solve that, because you'd have there's a huge amount of variability to what the player knows and what he doesn't, without some sort of like player-driven help system where they're actually, choosing what they look at, some kind of glossary or horrible thing like that. I don't have any clear ideas right away. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.